Lady Han stepped out of Su Ji's modest home with a dazed expression, her silk robes swaying softly with each step. The late afternoon sun did little to warm the chill that had settled deep in her chest. Her face was carefully composed, but her mind was a flurry of disbelief, shock, and, most of all, triumph. Earlier, Su Ji had poured the tea with a steady hand, but her eyes never left Lady Han's. There was a heaviness in the air, something unspoken tightening the space between them. "Lady Han," Su Ji began, her voice low but urgent, "what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. But you must hear me." Lady Han arched a brow, skeptical. "Go on." Su Ji leaned forward. "Jialmi's real name is Ji Yun. And he is not who you think." Lady Han blinked. "He? What are you talking about?" "He's a man," Su Ji said plainly. "His father Sungmin disguised him as a woman years ago. It was a plan, carefully plotted, to gain access to the palace, to the royal family, to power." Lady Han stared at her, lips parted in silent disbelief, then gave a short, incredulous laugh. "That's absurd. Do you hear yourself?" Then she frowned. "Do you realize you can be beheaded for false assumptions against the royal family?" But Su Ji simply smiled. "I am sure you must have noticed that Jialmi is distant. She keeps everyone at arm's length. Doesn't let anyone get too close, not even her maids." Lady Han's expression faltered. "It's not because she's shy or noble, sensitive or modest," Su Ji continued, her eyes sharp. "It's because she's afraid someone will find out what she really is." Silence. "I'm willing to go to the queen herself," Su Ji added, her voice unwavering. "I'll tell her the truth. That's how certain I am." Lady Han exhaled slowly, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. "But why?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "Why would you reveal this now? What do you gain from this?" Su Ji's gaze darkened. "Because I can't stand watching Ji Yun deceive everyone. The entire kingdom has been fooled. He's stolen a future that doesn't belong to him." Lady Han said nothing for a long moment, but her thoughts were already racing. Now. She walked briskly through the quiet streets, her thoughts electric with anticipation. Ji Yun. A man. The name pulsed in her head like a drumbeat. She found it hard to believe, but the more she thought about it, she realized everything suddenly made sense: his distance, his guarded manner, his calculated perfection. And now, Lady Han finally had the weapon she needed. Her daughter Min Seo would be queen. She saw it so clearly now, standing beside Kyung Hun, adorned in royal jewels, the crown fitted perfectly on her brow. Ji Yun would be removed, disgraced. The royal wedding was in a few days, but the truth would not wait that long. First the queen, Lady Han thought, a satisfied smile curving her lips. Then, Jin Suk. As she neared the palace gates, her steps quickened. The world felt full of possibility again, each moment bringing her closer to the life she had always envisioned. But behind her, several paces back, hidden in the shadow of a vendor's cart, stood a figure cloaked in plain gray robes. Silent. Still. Watching.
In the quiet hush of the queen's private chamber, the atmosphere was deceptively calm. A servant had just finished pouring tea, the delicate clink of porcelain barely registering as Lady Han stood before the queen, her hands folded neatly in front of her, trying to contain her racing heart. "Your Majesty," she said with a small bow, her voice measured, almost hesitant. "There is something I must share with you. Something deeply troubling about Jialmi." The queen, seated in her cushioned chair by the window, turned her gaze from the garden outside to Lady Han. One glance at the older woman's face, and her interest sharpened. She immediately dismissed the maids, leaving them both alone. "Speak," she commanded softly, but firmly. "Her real name is Ji Yun. And he is not a woman. He is a man." disguised by his father for years in order to gain access to the palace and rise to power. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the curtains. The queen didn't move, didn't blink. It was as if her mind had stopped working altogether, trying to make sense of the words she had just heard. Then, in an instant, the silence shattered. "What?" The queen's voice cracked like thunder. She stood up so abruptly that the small tea table beside her rattled. "Are you saying my son is married to a man? That this entire court has been made a fool of?" Lady Han flinched slightly at the sheer force of her rage. "Yes, Your Majesty. I was told this morning by Lady Su-ji, the wife to the friend of her father who has evidence and is even willing to speak to you herself. I did not believe her at first. But when I thought of Jialmi, no Ju Yun's behavior, how distant he's always been, how carefully he's kept people away, it all began to make sense." The queen's face was pale with fury, her hands trembling as they clenched into fists. "And my son? Is Prince Kyung Hun aware of this?" Her voice dropped to a sharp whisper, full of dread. I don't believe he is," Lady Han replied quickly. "However, I didn't ask." But the queen's mind was already spiraling. Her voice turned into a hiss. "No. No, he might know. I remember, moments ago, I overheard him once. He referred to Jialmi as he. I dismissed it, thought he simply misspoke. But what if he knew? What if he's accepting this?" She turned away, as if the thought alone sickened her. She pressed a hand to her temple and let out a sound that was something between a sob and a growl. "This is an abomination. This deceit, this shame, in my palace. In the heart of the royal family." She turned back to Lady Han, her face stony now, controlled again, but only barely. "This cannot be allowed to continue. The wedding is in a few days. If the truth comes out after, the disgrace will ruin us. The court, the people, they will see weakness. Corruption. Perverse betrayal." Her voice lowered dangerously. "Ji Yun must be removed. Immediately. Quietly, but completely." Lady Han nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Summon him to my chambers," the queen ordered, her voice like cold iron. "Now. I will speak to him myself. And when I'm done, this palace will never see his face again." Lady Han bowed deeply. "As you command." As she turned to leave, the queen stared out the window again, her jaw clenched tight, her breath shallow. The betrayal cut deep, not just to her pride, but to the very image of the royal house. And she would not rest until the stain was scrubbed clean. In the palace courtyard, the warm afternoon breeze rustled the trees gently as Ji Yun sat beneath the cherry blossom tree, fingers gliding across the strings of the gagamayan. The soft, melodic tones floated through the air like drifting petals, weaving a calm stillness around him. It had been a long time since he'd last played, and he could feel the music pulling something peaceful from deep within, a stillness he rarely allowed himself to touch anymore. Two of the royal maids stood nearby, eyes fixed on him, half mesmerized by the sound. "Your Highness," one of them said softly, clasping her hands in front of her chest. "Forgive me, but you play so beautifully. It's like the music is telling a story." Ji Yun offered a small, polite smile. "Thank you. It's something I used to love before arriving here. I haven't had the chance to play again since the competition." The other maid giggled, nudging her friend. "The crown prince is so lucky. Honestly, I've never seen him so devoted. You've changed him, truly." "Oh yes," the first maid chimed in eagerly, "before you came along, he was. Well, let's just say he knew how to charm all the court ladies. But ever since he met you, it's like he sees no one else." Ji Yun felt his cheeks flush slightly, unsure whether to smile or shrink under their words. "And the way he rushed the marriage," the second maid added with dreamy eyes. ignoring all the proper procedures, going against the ministers. Everyone said it was scandalous, but we all knew it was love. He was so terrified when you were kidnapped, the first maid said, her tone dropping slightly. The entire palace could feel his worry. Ji-yun looked down at the instrument in his lap, the melody in his head slowly fading. It was a terrifying time, he admitted softly. And the one behind it all, the maid continued with a slight frown, was that friend of yours. Sun-hee, was it? The one who used to follow you around like a shadow during the competition? Ji-yun blinked, startled. Sun-hee? They both nodded, eyes wide. She's in prison now. She confessed everything to the prince. It's how we all knew you were kidnapped. Ji-yun stared at them in stunned silence, the strings of the gagamian forgotten beneath his fingers. Sun-hee? No, he had thought she'd simply gone home after the selection. But why? He murmured to himself. Why would she? Maybe jealousy? One maid offered. The palace changes people. But we were shocked too. You were always so close. Ji-yun barely heard the rest. His mind was spinning. Why didn't Kyung Hun tell me? He was still trying to make sense of it when another maid hurried into the courtyard, bowing quickly. Your Highness, she said, breathless, Her Majesty, the Queen has summoned you to her chambers. At once. Ji-yun lifted his eyes, surprised. The Queen? Yes, Your Highness. He hesitated for a moment, a strange twist forming in his gut. What could she want with me? He wondered. But he stood, smoothing his robes, and nodded. Very well, he said quietly. Lead the way. He gave his gagayam to the maid who took it away and then walked toward the Queen's chambers, his two attendants trailing close behind, the soft echo of his footsteps unable to quiet the questions now swirling in his mind. In the softly lit confines of Lady Min's royal tailor shop, bolts of silk in every shade of the rainbow lined the walls like a painter's dream. The scent of pressed fabric and fresh ink filled the air, mingling with the quiet rustle of fine materials as Lady Min moved gracefully through her workspace. Crown Prince Kyung Hun stood by the table, rolling up a small parchment and handing it to her. These are Jialmi's latest measurements, he said, his tone calm, but tinged with the warmth that always crept into his voice when he spoke of Ji-yun. Lady Min took the parchment with a faintly forced smile. I see, she said, unfolding it. I was hoping to take them myself. Kyung Hun gave her a knowing glance. She shrugged, dramatic but light-hearted. It's just not the same working off numbers. I'm a woman of art, Your Highness. I read people's spirit through their posture, their shoulders, the way they breathe in silk. She sighed wistfully, then waved a hand. But I suppose this will do. Kyung Hun chuckled. You've never failed to create something magnificent, Lady Min. I trust you. Her eyes sparkled despite the slight pout on her lips. You're lucky I like you, Your Highness. Otherwise, I would make your consort look like a walking curtain. He laughed, shaking his head. You wouldn't dare. She tapped the parchment. Fine, fine. Your wife will be beautiful. I'll make sure of it. A few moments later, as he stepped out into the open hallway, Kyung Hun felt the tension of the palace settle back on his shoulders. Min Suk walked beside him, chatting idly about the final wedding arrangements. But then Kyung Hun's steps slowed. Across the courtyard, he caught sight of Ji-yun walking steadily with two maids flanking him. They were heading toward the Queen's chambers. Kyung Hun frowned, his body stilling entirely. There was nothing overtly unusual about the scene. Ji-yun often moved about the palace with his maids, but something in the air felt wrong. Off-kilter. The direction. The Queen's chambers. His instincts stirred uncomfortably. What's wrong? Min Suk asked, pausing beside him. Kyung Hun narrowed his eyes, gaze fixed on Ji-Yun's retreating form. I don't like this. You think something's happened? I'm not sure, he muttered. But I have a bad feeling. He turned to Min Suk quickly. Stay here. I want to see what this is about. Min Suk raised a brow. Want me to come with you? No, Kyung Hun said firmly. I'll go alone. With that, he turned, his expression tightening as he began walking in the same direction, keeping just far enough behind to not be noticed, but close enough to intervene if needed. In his chest, something uneasy began to churn. Whatever awaited Ji-Yun inside the Queen's chambers, Kyung Hun wasn't about to let him face it alone. The heavy doors to the Queen's private quarters creaked open, the sound echoing through the ornate hallway as Ji-Yun stepped inside, his hands folded politely in front of him. His maids paused just outside, exchanging a small glance of concern. They had seen the tension in the air too but said nothing as the doors shut firmly behind him. Ji-Yun had barely taken 2 steps into the grand chamber when... Smack! The sharp crack of skin meeting skin echoed off the gilded walls. Ji-Yun's head snapped to the side, his cheek stinging with a burning heat. He blinked, stunned, unable to process what had just happened. The Queen stood before him, her hand still raised, face contorted in rage. You deceiver! She shrieked. How dare you! Ji-Yun's breath caught in his throat. Your Majesty, You lied to all of us. She spat, taking a step forward as though to strike him again, her jeweled hairpins trembling with every shake of her fury. You think you can parade around here in silks and steal my son's heart with your sweet little eyes and delicate voice? You are a man. A man who has been playing a disgusting game with the royal family. Before she could reach him again, the doors burst open behind them. Mother, stop! Kyung Hun's voice rang out like a crack of thunder. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and stepped between Ji-Yun and his mother, his arm protectively outstretched. Mother, what are you doing? Have you lost your mind? The Queen froze mid-motion, her chest heaving. You are asking me that? He is a man, Kyung Hun. A man. Kyung Hun didn't flinch. He stood his ground. I know. The words dropped into the room like a bomb. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Lady Han, standing in the corner, gasped aloud, her eyes wide with disbelief. The Queen stared at her son as if seeing him for the first time. You knew? She whispered. You knew all this time? Kyung Hun's jaw clenched. Yes. I've always known. Both women stood in stunned silence, the Queen's mouth hanging slightly open before fury flooded her face again. So you married him, knowing, choosing this disgrace? Have you gone mad? Do you not understand what this means for the family? For the crown? For the kingdom? I understand exactly what it means, Kyung Hun said coldly. And I don't care. I love him. The Queen let out a sound like a wounded animal. You think this is love? What does he want? Power? Position? Did he bewitch you? What did he want from you? Ji-Yun stepped forward, his voice soft but steady. Nothing. I never intended for this to happen. But I fell in love with him. And I'm sorry if that offends you, but it's the truth. The Queen recoiled like his words physically stung her. You dare to speak of love to my face? After lying your way into my son's arms. You will leave. You will leave this palace and this kingdom and never return. Be grateful I'm not ordering your head this very moment. No. Kyung Hun's voice dropped low, calm, but dangerous. If you do anything to hurt Ji-Yun, if you force him to leave, if you expose us, if you lift a single hand against him. He paused, stepping closer to his mother, his voice hardening into steel. Then I won't become king. The Queen's eyes widened. You. What? You heard me, Kyung Hun said. You want to be queen mother? You want the crown passed cleanly to me instead of one of father's illegitimate sons? You want to keep Tae-jin and the others far from power? His voice was ice. Then don't touch him. Because if anything happens to Ji-yoon, he'll walk away. And you'll watch that dream of yours go up in flames. Lady Han looked like the breath had been knocked from her lungs. Your Highness, surely you don't mean. I do, he said sharply, turning to her. And you? You do well to keep your mouth shut. I know where this started. Lady Han looked away, shame creeping across her face. The queen stared at her son, her eyes searching his face for any sign that this was a bluff. But she saw none. Only resolve. You're willing to risk everything for him? She asked hoarsely. Kyung Hun nodded. He has no one else. I'm all he has. And I'm not going to abandon him. The queen opened her mouth, but nothing came. For the first time in many years, she was speechless. Kyung Hun turned to Ji-yoon, gently took his hand, and led him toward the door. Let's go, he said firmly. When the maids outside instinctively moved to follow, he raised a hand to stop them. No one follows us. They obeyed, stepping back as the crown prince led Ji-yoon down the corridor and away, his back straight, his grip unwavering. As the heavy doors shut behind Kyung Hun and Ji-yoon, an eerie silence settled over the queen's chamber like a thick fog. Lady Han, still reeling from what she had just witnessed, turned sharply toward the queen. Your Majesty. You're just going to let him go? She asked, disbelief coating every word. You're letting that boy stay in the palace after everything we just learned? The queen, usually so commanding, now looked as though the weight of her crown had finally begun to crush her. She slowly lowered herself into a nearby chair, her hands trembling ever so slightly in her lap. What choice do I have? She murmured, staring blankly at the golden inlay of the floor. If I force Ji-yoon out, I lose Kyung Hun. And if I lose him, I lose everything I've worked for. All the years I spent making sure the throne would be his, all of it will be for nothing. That snake Tae-jin will rise instead, and everything will be out of my control. Lady Han blinked, stunned by the queen's sudden vulnerability. But what about the king? Shouldn't he? No, the queen snapped sharply, regaining a flicker of her former strength. No one must know. Not even the king. Especially not him. Lady Han hesitated before nodding slowly. As you wish, Your Majesty, she said, bowing her head. My lips are sealed. But inside, her thoughts were already racing. It didn't matter. Jin Suk will know. I must find a way to tell him. That night, the flicker of candlelight danced against the polished walls of the crown prince's chamber. Kyung Hun sat quietly at the edge of the room, his arms resting on his knees, gaze fixed on the small figure curled up on the bedding. Ji-yoon was crying softly, his shoulders shaking in silence. No dramatic sobs, no words. Just quiet pain that echoed louder than any scream. Kyung Hun's heart twisted at the sight. He wanted to go to him, to hold him, to say something that would ease the ache, but something told him not to. Not yet. Ji-yoon's pain wasn't something his arms could erase tonight. So he just sat there. Watching. Guarding. And wondering. Is he happier here? Or is he just suffering more because of me? Would letting him go be the kinder choice? Just as the thought began to form, Ji-yoon suddenly stirred. He wiped at his eyes quickly and sat up, his face unreadable as he moved toward the door. Kyung Hun stood at once, instinctively stepping in front of him. Where are you going? Ji-yoon paused, surprised but clearly agitated. To the dungeons. Kyung Hun frowned. Now? Why? Ji-yoon's expression twisted, a storm behind his eyes. I know about Sun-hee. About what she did. His voice cracked slightly. She betrayed me. She was behind the kidnapping. She's in prison, and you never told me. Kyung Hun's jaw tightened with guilt. I didn't want to hurt you, he admitted quietly. At first. I thought protecting you from it was the right thing. And then, everything else happened. I should have told you. I'm sorry. Ji-yoon didn't answer right away. His fists clenched at his sides. I just need to see her, he said finally. Alone. Kyung Hun studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Fine, he said softly. But don't be long. And if anything feels off, send word. Promise me. Ji-yoon nodded stiffly and left without another word, the door shutting behind him with a muted thud. Kyung Hun remained still, staring at the door. Letting him go. Is that really what love is?
The prison was dim and cold, its stone walls damp with the weight of silence and secrets. The head guard, a broad-shouldered man with a skeptical face, did a double take as Ji-yoon approached under the cover of night. Your Highness. This is unexpected, the guard said, bowing respectfully. I'm here to see Sun Hee, Ji-yoon replied quietly. Guard nodded, clearly curious but respectful. Follow me. She's in the secluded area. No one's visited her since she arrived. Ji-yoon followed him through the twisting, narrow halls, past rows of barred cells where the occasional prisoner stirred or coughed in the darkness. The smell of damp stone and iron filled the air. Finally, they stopped at the end of the corridor. Behind the bars, slumped on a straw mat, was Sun Hee. She looked up as the torchlight neared, her face pale, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes widened with something close to joy. She breathed, struggling to her feet. You came. Ji-yoon stood still. Stop right there. Her expression crumbled. I'm sorry, she said quickly, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry. What I did. There's no excuse. Ji-yoon dismissed the soldier and he left, leaving both alone. We were close, Sun Hee, Ji-yoon said, his voice tight with emotion. You were the one person I trusted completely. Why would you do such a thing to me? Sun Hee grabbed the bars, tears streaming down her face. I was desperate. Min Seo used that against me. Just like every noble person, my father owes her father. I was promised that our debts would be paid off if I betrayed you, but the moment they dragged you away, I knew I had ruined everything. Ji-yoon's fingers loosened. And all that story about the man you loved? It was a lie to get you to empathize with me. I know I did wrong, she nodded through the tears. But I can make it right. I swear. He frowned. How? Sun Hee leaned in, lowering her voice to a whisper. I know who killed the assassins. The one sent after you. Ji-yoon's eyes widened. What? I saw what happened that night. I saw something. It was someone I recognized, she said, her voice trembling. But I won't say anything here. Not like this. I'll tell you everything, I swear. But only if you get me out of here. Ji-yoon stared at her, heart pounding. His trust was shattered, but the promise of answers tugged at him like a ripped current. He needed to know the truth. But could he risk freeing her? Meanwhile, across the city under a moonless sky, Lady Han moved swiftly through a narrow alley, her dark cloak fluttering behind her. Every few steps, she glanced over her shoulder, the soft clip of her boots barely echoing on the cobbled street. The city was quiet, shadows stretching like fingers across the street. Just as she rounded a corner, her steps faltered. A dark silhouette stepped from the shadows, directly into her path. Lady Han froze, her breath catching in her throat. Who? The figure didn't speak. Only stared. And the night, suddenly, felt far colder. Thanks for watching. Do like, share and subscribe to the channel for more episodes.